Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Biggest Battle of the First Crusade, Battle of Antioch, 1098 by Kings and Generals. This is the next episode in their First Crusade series. Last time we witnessed a pretty impressive victory for Bohemond against his Muslim opponents, and the continuation of the Siege of Antioch. Considering this one is the Battle of Antioch, I presume that whole thing is going to come to a close. I'm excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
In our last episode on the First Crusade, the Crusader army besieged Antioch on its way to Jerusalem, and managed to repel two separate relief forces from Damascus and Aleppo.
Antioch, a very important city historically in that region, so it's sort of an important stop to make. It's also sort of a symbolically important power center. It's an important city for many reasons, culturally, historically, militarily, and so it's a worthwhile stop to make.
While maintaining the siege for months, starvation, cold, desertion, and disease tested the religious convictions of the expedition. But in this episode, they'll face their most difficult and bloody trial yet. The year was 1098, and the Latins were about to change history in more ways than one.
Wow.
To think about alt history.
Okay, I'm excited to see this because so far, the series began with a lot of L's for the Crusaders. Over the last couple of videos, we've seen some more successes, but still, nothing revolutionary yet. They haven't really made a massive difference in the region, I'd say, apart from allowing the Byzantine Empire to reconquer some of its territory. But it seems that now we're getting to something really consequential.
For a second, though, there's something that could have easily prevented all this Crusader chaos
at time.
And a lot more historic troubles besides. Listen to my advice.
So you guys know the deal. Go and check out this video by Kings and Generals. It's linked in the description. Go and give them a like, subscribe to their channel, and please go and check out their sponsor. Show them some support for making such fantastic videos.
And try Endel via the link in the description. The first 100 people to go there will get
There
a
you
week
go.
of
Go
Endel
use their
audio
link.
experiences for free. So hurry up and relax already. Against all odds, Bohemond and his 700 managed to repel a force of 10,000 with a combination of shock tactics, bravery, and insanity. An
Incredibly.
audacious move that not
Bohemond is kind of setting himself apart as a rather impressive leader at this point.
only saved the campaign, but provided essential food and supplies. Back at the camp, the Crusaders held out against another sally attempt from the garrison. Winter subsided, and seeing the Norman knights returning lifted the spirits of the besiegers, who once again believed that God was on their side. This triumphal
Well, you better hope that God's on your side if you're doing a literal crusade. You're reclaiming the Holy Land from, what you see as infidels. You better hope that God's on your side, or this whole thing is for naught.
march from the Battle of the Iron Bridge was also witnessed by an unlikely emissary at the camp. Indeed, representatives of the Fatimid Caliphate had arrived at the camp on the day of the battle, responding to the letters the Crusaders wrote earlier after Alexios suggested it, outlining the political disarray in the Muslim world. Despite the religious fervor of the hosts, the guests were shown great hospitality, receiving gifts from the recently plundered camp.
Very interesting diplomatic connection to make. It is also a little bit of evidence that though, of course, the whole crusade was inspired by this religious mission, it's not all about religion. This is partly political. Particularly for the Byzantines, it was almost entirely political. But even for these crusaders, who I'm sure many of them have a genuine belief in the mission, for a lot of them, it's also partially political as well. We've already talked about how they're conquering lands, they're taking stuff for their own, they're winning loot and glory, all of that. That's not really religious. Those are, some very earthly desires. But even this shows that, it's not entirely a religious conquest. There's some political aspects to it as well. And they're willing to politically maneuver.
Peter the Hermit was chosen to negotiate, but it soon became clear that the Egyptians believed that this army was essentially a Byzantine force. The emissaries knew that those who took the cross and went on a mission answering the call made by Alexios
is a very interesting map that we're looking at, because we have the Fatimid Caliphate, which is centered around Egypt. Some of the caliphates of the past, of course, held a lot of land. I mean, they held all of Arabia, Iraq, Iran, a lot of this territory that now is held by the Seljuks, and, will go on to be held by the Ottomans. They will become the dominant empire in this region. So it's sort of an interesting geopolitical setup we have right now. And you can kind of see, given that, religion isn't the only goal of this mission, why the Crusaders might try and make some, diplomatic outreaches to the Fatimid Caliphate, because, there might be some competition between them and the Seljuks, or some of the other Muslim polities and states within the region. It seems like, geopolitically, the region is quite complicated and a little chaotic at this point.
Were paid generously by him, and all swore an oath to return any former Byzantine city to him. Over half of the initial force had already lost their lives on this journey, and over 100 strategic locations were handed over to the Romans, or were temporarily held in the case of Baldwin, who had not yet made his county of Edessa official. Shipments from...
Yeah, well, we talked about how, I just mentioned how, there were political goals as well. And some of the Crusaders would surely be more inspired by the religious fervor. Some of them, like Baldwin's a good example, were far more inspired by a call to glory, loot, and conquest. He was off doing his own thing at this point. He had already ditched the, religious conquest of the Holy Land, and he was going, fully towards building his own power base.
From the Empire continued to be the crucial lifeline that supported the Crusade. But Taticius had left, and there was no Byzantine representative to deal with the Fatimids. So why would they deal with these mercenaries? The envoys stayed in the camp for over a month before returning to Cairo with a few Franks. Both sides agreed to neutrality, which prevented a potential blockade from the only powerful Muslim navy in the region.
Okay. I mean, that's better than nothing. And as we've seen, the Byzantines are still keeping up some supply lines to the Crusaders, but I think having regained a lot of their territory in Anatolia, because the empire was truly close to collapse at one point, they seem to have pulled back from the crusade a little bit, even though they ordered it in the first place. They've gotten a lot out of it so far, and they're kind of like, okay, maybe we should, we don't have to involve ourselves too much at this point. We've already gained a lot.
The coming of March signaled the end of the hardest phase of the campaign so far. Many were slain, others died from cold and disease, the poor died from hunger, those who couldn't endure the horrors of siege warfare deserted, and the women were exiled.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear the casualty numbers throughout the First Crusade, but, it seems like just as many as were killed in battle were killed by environmental causes. Lack of food, exposure to the elements, exhaustion, disease. In fact, probably far more, given how long a distance they've traveled. Of course, they've faced a lot of rather impressive Muslim forces, and there's been some pretty impressive Crusader victories where they were greatly outnumbered, like we saw with Bohemond last time. But, seems like their enemy, even more than that, is the environment, their shaky supply lines, disease, all that stuff I mentioned before.
However, those who remained were some of the most hardened, committed, and toughest warriors in history, with exceptional training and discipline.
Wow.
Looking back on this period, Anselm of Ribemont, a knight who had lived through the Antiochene winter, wrote, "Growing stronger and stronger, therefore, from that day our men took counsel with renewed courage."
Okay. So there's a decreased number of Crusaders, but, the Crusaders, they haven't been winning battles due to the numerical superiority of their forces. They've been winning due to the superior training, experience and dedication of their men. And those who are left, are experienced, well-trained, and certainly dedicated.
On the 4th of March, an English fleet arrived at St. Simeon carrying supplies, tools, and craftsmen. Resources that would not just extend, but end the siege. Up until this point, the garrison was constantly in contact with the outside world, trading information and resources through its southern gates. To secure the heavy supplies from the relatively distant port, the two most powerful princes, Beaumont and Raymond, were chosen to go on this escort mission, accompanied by 60 knights and 500 infantry. Once again, the all-seeing citadel observed these movements, and Yaghi-Sian had his mounted archers harass the Crusader camp, while laying an ambush close to the bridge gate.
Yaghi-Sian, I think so far has been doing a pretty good job of keeping things under control. He has been taking opportunities where he saw them, whenever he has a chance to send some of his men out and harass or skirmish with the Crusaders, he's done that. It hasn't brought the siege to an end so far, but he is being proactive, which is, it's good.
The return journey from the port took 3 days, and once the convoy was spotted, the trap was sprung. On the 7th of March, the Seljuks screamed and galloped at a vulnerable gap in the infantry line. To quote the chronicler, "The Turks began to gnash their teeth and chatter and howl with very loud cries, wheeling around our men, throwing darts and loosing arrows, wounding and slaughtering them most brutally. Their attack was so fierce that our men began to flee over the nearest mountain or wherever there was path. Those who could get away quickly escaped alive, and those who could not were killed."
It's worth remembering that, these are some pretty dedicated and well-trained crusaders, knights at this point, but their enemies, the Seljuk Turks, these are also some pretty fierce warriors. They're particularly good cavalrymen. They've been riding from youth. They're very skilled, so, they're not going up against an unimposing force. Their enemies are also very talented.
The majority of the infantry was quickly broken, yet only 2 knights were lost, pointing to the lack of cohesion in the Crusader ranks. Commanding the rearguard, Beaumont rushed in with reinforcements, while Godfrey of Bouillon rallied his troops from the camp and joined the fray. An intense battle ensued before the walls of Antioch, which only intensified as Yaghi-Sian poured in more troops from the garrison. After months of stare-downs and harassment, the two sides finally met in the open field.
Damn. Alright, they're both really going for it at this point. Once again, Beaumont is rushing right in. Whatever you want to say about Beaumont, there's some moral judgments you can make of all these guys. He is not afraid to get right into battle. He is a good leader. He will rush right in and, lead his men directly right in the front of the battle. He's not afraid.
Garrison was pushed back towards the bridge gate as panic overwhelmed the Muslim forces. Our primary source wrote, "Those who did not succeed in crossing the bridge alive because of the great press of men and horses suffered their everlasting death with the devil and his imps. For we came after them, driving them into the river or throwing them down, so that the water of that swift stream seemed to be running red with the blood of Turks. And if by chance any of them tried to climb up the pillars of the bridge, or to reach the bank by swimming, he was stricken by our men, who were standing all along the river bank."
I like all the sources we've been using for this one. Kings and Generals have found some really good quotations to display and really give us an idea of the scenes that they're describing. And this one really sort of shows the brutality of the event. Just an absolute slugfest. Seems to be turning into an absolute massacre. Just imagine you're squeezed onto this bridge, there's men falling off, there's people trying to climb up, they're being slaughtered, the river is running red with blood. That is a pretty horrifying sight to imagine.
Yaghi-Sian played his hand, knowing he had the advantages of intelligence, mobility, and the element of surprise. Had his ambush succeeded, the Crusaders would have lost their leaders, precious supplies, and the initiative from the recent victory. Multiple eyewitnesses who later wrote about this engagement reported that both sides lost 1,500 men each, a number which reduced the enemy garrison substantially. The Christian clergy held services commemorating those who had lost their lives.
I mean, that's a substantial loss for the Crusaders. They don't have that many men. But it's an even worse loss for the defenders of Antioch. I mean, they have limited manpower, and they really cannot afford to lose any more men. They need them to defend the city. So that's a pretty big L for them.
While the survivors flaunted their newly gained Arabian horses and silk clothes. At dawn, the Muslims from Antioch briefly left the city so they could bury their dead in a nearby abandoned mosque, alongside cloaks, coins, bows, and arrows. Once again, contemporary sources report, when our men heard this, they came in haste to that devil's chapel and ordered the bodies to be dug up and the tombs destroyed, and the dead men dragged out of their graves. They threw all the corpses into a pit and cut off their heads and brought them to our tents so that they could count the number exactly, except for those that they loaded onto 4 horses belonging to the ambassadors of the Emir of Cairo.
Yeah, so the Crusaders have really been trying some intimidation tactics. And once again, I mean, this is just straight disrespectful. I mean, they won the battle. You have Muslims coming out to bury their men, and the Crusaders dig them up, cut their heads off, and use them to intimidate the defenders of the city. I mean, that's just in bad taste. But, clearly they're riled up with the fervor of God. They believe themselves to have a righteous cause, and like I said earlier, they believe their enemies to be infidels, so they're really willing to do anything to promote their own success, I guess, or to intimidate the enemy, or to win the battle, however they see it.
On the 10th of March, work began on a new fort, built on top of the abandoned mosque itself, which was renamed La Marie, or Blessed Mary. This was no fortress, but it provided cover against arrow fire and choked the crucial bridge gate under the command of Raymond. By the end of the month, the garrison launched a surprise attack on the fort, testing its strength, and nearly succeeded. However, heavy rain poured down, slowing them long enough for reinforcements to arrive and push them back. Another divine sign that lifted the spirits of one side and tested the resolve of the other.
It's really interesting seeing, I was going to say the Crusaders, but both sides with these very religious worldviews. Any event that happens, particularly natural events like weather, but really any event at all, is interpreted as some sort of sign from God. And it can be interpreted in many ways. So it's just sort of interesting to see whatever happens. You'll have the Muslims too, but we're seeing this more from the Crusaders' perspectives. You'll see the Crusaders interpreting it as, oh, we've pleased God, we've displeased God. God is saying this, God is saying that. It's a very different worldview from, my worldview, and I think many people's worldviews these days. But it's certainly, it's interesting, and it's worth pointing out, because to sort of understand the history, we have to understand how the people of that time, these people in particular, would have viewed events and how they would have saw things. And these people see things through the lens of Christianity, of course. That is their worldview.
In April, the noose tightened after Tancred was appointed and paid to secure an abandoned monastery near the St. George Gate. And within days, his party managed to capture a Syrian and Armenian trade caravan, taking grain, wine, and oil, which now fed the Crusaders instead of the city.
The Crusaders are really closing them in at this point. They don't have enough men to do a full perimeter, but they're sort of closing off all the choke points into Antioch. Soon the city's probably going to start running out of supplies.
While not totally encircled, the city now received limited supplies from the hard-to-reach Iron Gate as tensions grew. Muslim sallies stopped, allowing the foraging to continue, while shipments from the Empire became far more frequent. Then, suddenly, the Crusaders received lavish gifts of horses and weapons, courtesy of the new ruler of Edessa, Baldwin of Bouillon.
Wow. Look at that, we see Baldwin popping up again. I'm not going to lie, I thought he had completely abandoned the cause, but at least he's devoted enough to send some supplies.
In this period, emissaries were sent to Tripoli, which reveals a truly fragmented Islamic world, Antioch's neighbor knew full well of the month-long struggle, and many were not only unconcerned, but even treated the Latins with great hospitality as they freely traveled the Levant.
Wow. Interesting.
The only other significant event throughout April and May involved the captured crusader René Pochet. Yaghi wanted to ransom the man and dragged him to the walls to negotiate for his price if he renounced Christianity. Upon the man's refusal, the ruler of Antioch commanded that all of the remaining captives be rounded up, tied in a circle, and burned alive. The screams echoed in the city and crusader camp, and acted as a sign to both sides that there could be no middle ground.
Yeah, clearly. And once again, we're seeing that brutality on both sides. I mean, they're both driven by their faith, and of course, in the case of Yaghi, this is a force of people defending their city, so both sides clearly feel justified to use any sort of tactics they want to use, including, horrific acts like burning men alive. Of course, when you do stuff like that, and when the Crusaders dig up Muslim corpses, for example, all this brutality we've seen in this video and others, there's not going to be any compromise at that point. Y'all are probably going to fight right to the death. You've become so polarized.
Despite this, around the end of May, the Crusaders received a message from the garrison, who were ready to surrender.
Really?
A few representatives were sent into the city, including the Constable of France, Wello, only to be killed once inside.
Of
Whether
course.
this was a trap or another discovered and prevented plot, this gave a glimpse of a possible key inside the city, one which Bohemond was already working on for months. Back in April, his men made contact with a member of the city guard named Firuz, a Christian who converted to Islam, responsible for one of the southeastern towers on the slopes of the mountain, called the Tower of the Two Sisters. The proximity to Tancred's position, his ability to speak Greek, and the distance from the rest of the Crusaders allowed Bohemond to exchange intel via the Armenian merchant caravans, which were selectively granted entry to the city. Without revealing his agent to the rest of the Crusaders, the Norman summoned the council and gave a speech. "Most gallant knights, you see that we are all, both great and small, in dire poverty and misery, and we do not know whence better fortune will come to us. If, therefore, you think it is a good and proper plan, let one of us set himself above the others on the condition that if he can capture the city or engineer its downfall by any means, by himself or by others, he will agree to give it to him."
So this is what I'm saying when I talk about political motivations, and those political motivations sometimes causing tension or competition amongst the Crusaders. These guys are playing for keeps. They're all trying to win glory, honor, land, and they're in direct competition with each other to do that. And so they're all trying to outperform each other. We've seen them, come into direct conflict before. This isn't necessarily that, but it is a sneaky little trick. You've figured out, you think you have a way to conquer the city, and so you suggest this, very tricky, but clearly, in this instance, you're looking out for yourself more than perhaps the overall cause, even though it is beneficial to the entire cause.
Bohemond was a legend within the camp, but the rest of the leaders knew his ambition and refused his offer.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. We know exactly what he's doing, but even if you don't, you'd be thinking, yeah, okay, not a chance. We can see that you're trying to outmaneuver us. We don't know exactly how you plan to conquer the city, Bohemond, but you're a talented guy, so we are not gonna accept that offer.
There was no point in rushing things. The garrison's morale was failing. The Crusaders were finally well supplied and fed, and from their perspective, it was only a matter of time before they were victorious. But a storm had been brewing in the east for several months, as one ambitious leader was rallying the Muslim world and heading straight to Antioch.
Really?
Yaghi youngest son, Muhammad, had made it all the way to Baghdad and convinced the Caliph to send a relief force. The man he chose to lead this army was none other than Kerbogha, Atabeg of Mosul, a Seljuk Turk who had spent the decade chasing down enemies and changing allegiances before securing Harran, Nisibis, and Mosul in the name of the Caliph in 1096.
Okay.
The situation in Antioch provided him with the opportunity to truly prove himself, as well as carve out a holding with which to rise to the top of the collapsing Seljuk world.
Yeah, Seems like we might finally get a more united Muslim force. I talked about earlier, in Kings and Generals is basically also saying that the Muslim world is in a lot of chaos right now. Geopolitically, it's very divided. They said the collapsing Seljuk world. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not too familiar with Seljuk history, but I don't think it's too long from this point that the Ottomans begin to expand and really dominate the region. So over the next, I don't know, decades, 100+ years, the Seljuks are really on their way out. But Kerbogha seems like a talented guy, and maybe he can bring people together to try and prevent this crusade.
After 6 months of careful planning, he had managed to create a coalition with forces from Damascus, Haran, Horns, Mardin, Samosata, and Sinjar.
Wow.
The previous 2 relief forces were just over 10,000 men, but this coalition numbered between 35,000 and 45,000.
Yeah, those are some pretty damn impressive numbers for this time period. That's a pretty large army.
And was highly motivated. It is easy to draw parallels between an equal number of Christians from across the west to this Muslim force, and as it made its way to the west, rumors began to spread. First, Kerbogha arrived at Edessa and besieged it for 3 weeks, without any progress, before moving on to Antioch. The Crusaders sent out scouting parties to investigate them, and according to the chronicler, they saw the Muslim army swarming everywhere, from the mountains and different roads, like the sands of the sea, marveling at their infinite thousands, and totally unable to count them.
I'm very curious to see how this is going to go, because I don't know exactly how many men the Crusaders have, but I can tell you that they are greatly outnumbered at the moment. I mean, they've been outnumbered before, but this is on a whole nother level. So I'm very curious to see what's going to happen. Will they be defeated? Will they win? And if they do win, I mean, how are they going to pull this off?
As the scouts returned on the 28th of May, reporting that the enemy was a few days away, the Crusaders knew that their position was untenable. At this dire moment, Bohemond once again spoke to the council, and this time all except Raymond agreed, but adding the stipulation that, if Bohemond took the city on his own, or with the aid of others, it would be granted to him, but only on the condition that Antioch would be returned to the emperor if Alexios came to their aid, as their honor was at stake. At that very moment, the identity of Firouz was revealed, and plans were drawn up to assault the city.
Damn, so Bohemond has, managed to use this moment of crisis to put his offer forward again. This time it was successful. He's clearly a very talented and crafty guy. We knew that, but, we can see that craftiness even as he maneuvers amongst his allies.
Due to fear that this scheme would also be discovered by the defenders, as well as to prevent desertion, the council agreed to keep both the plan and the news of the incoming army a secret. Firouz smuggled his son out of the city to act as a hostage, and the exact day and time were decided. The next few days were tense, as the Crusaders sensed that something must be going horribly wrong for the acting chairman of the council, Stephen of Blois, to desert under the pretext of being ill. Then, on the evening of the 3rd of June, 700 Crusaders departed from the camp in order to fool the defenders of the citadel. At roughly 3 a.m., the men returned to the slopes above the gate of St. George. A sizable contingent was under the command of Godfrey and Robert of Flanders, while the rest followed Bohemond. Everyone held their breath as they whistled at the Tower of Two Sisters.
I mean, can you imagine the tension at this moment? There's an army coming from the east, so you've got that to worry about. You've been besieging the city for a long time at this point. You have seen some success, but, you're still trying. This could finally be your way in. You've gathered a sizable force of men together in the middle of the night, and now you're waiting. You're waiting for your signal to be heard and for your plan to work. Is it going to work? Who knows? I mean, just the anxiety amongst the men standing there. The tension must have been absolutely palpable.
Before seeing Firouz throw down a thick rope, to which they attached a ladder.
It worked.
Not knowing what to expect, the Crusaders were reluctant. Would they be climbing to their death, much like the French constable? Would they end up in flames like the prisoners, or would they become the ones who broke this long siege? After being encouraged by Burmah, one by one they started climbing, but burdened by their heavy equipment and rushing to the top, a few of them fell, killing some and injuring others.
Ooh.
Everyone braced for disaster, but no watchman appeared on the battlements. 60 men in total, including Burmah, reached the top of the tower and stealth.
I mean, of course, Beaumont was one of the men who went up. As we talked about earlier, he has to lead from the front. But just from the way they're telling the story, you could just sense the nervousness amongst the men. It's like a sneaky nighttime assault. Anything could go wrong. They're climbing the ladders. People are falling off, dying because they're heavy armor. I mean, what a scene.
Stealthily killed the guards in the nearby 3 towers, as well as Firoz's brother by mistake.
Oops.
A postern gate was opened, and the remaining 600 crusaders rushed in.
There we
Burmah
go.
sounded his bugle, and while Godfrey and Robert rushed towards the citadel, a small band of men made as much noise as possible as they penetrated the city. Within minutes, the city erupted in chaos, as the besiegers who had threatened them for months were now finally inside. The Normans slashed at anything that moved in the darkness, and as the fear spread, there was no resistance, as everyone fled for their life.
Yeah, I would not expect any sort of mercy from the Crusaders in this situation. I mean, they've already shown their brutality. This has been a long siege. If you're a civilian, you should probably run for your life or hide if you can, because, like they said, they're slashing at anything that moves. I imagine this is going to be, there's going to be a lot of bloodshed.
Dawn broke, and the blood-red banner of Burmah could be seen from atop Mount Silpius. The city was taken by less than 1,000 men, so the frightened Christian populace opened the main gates and invited the Crusaders in, begging for their lives to be spared. None were spared that day.
Jesus.
Christians, Muslims, men, women, children, and elders. The chronicler wrote, "All the streets of the city on every side were full of corpses, so that no one could endure to be there because of the stench, nor could anyone walk along the narrow paths of the city except over the corpses of the dead."
See, and this is the real dark side of the Crusades, is the brutality and atrocities like this. As I literally just said, I'm not surprised that this happened. I think everybody knew this was coming. But, this is also where I think many of us would say that it sort of separates from Christianity. I mean, if you think about sort of a God-sent crusade to reconquer the Holy Land, now you're massacring an entire city of civilians, including Christians. That's not very Christian, is it? We've seen atrocities committed by the Crusaders in the past. It seems pretty hypocritical to me, right? Just an absolute bloodbath. Not surprising, but, obviously, still pretty horrible. Pretty tragic event to see.
The siege was over, but the attack on the citadel failed, leaving an isolated pocket of defenders with access to the Iron Gate. As for Yakisian, he managed to avoid the slaughter and evacuate from the city, only to be caught by some local Armenians who delivered his head to the Crusaders for a price. However, the Latins soon discovered that the horses in the garrison were unsuited for their style of warfare, and the supplies were dwindling. The very next day, on June 5th, 1098, they looked over the ramparts and saw the army of Kerbogha. Yet again, utter ruin was avoided, but yet again they had to face an impossible challenge.
Well, they conquered Antioch in just the right amount of time. If they'd taken a little bit longer, they probably would have been screwed. These events are happening very close together.
A knight named Roger of Barneville charged at the host with 15 of his men, only to be lured by a feigned retreat and wiped out.
Not that he had any chance anyway. That was a suicide mission, a kamikaze attack.
The besiegers now became the besieged, and they tried to fortify the city, while Kerbogha attacked the only fortification the Crusade.
How about that? They've been besieging the city for the longest time. They finally got themselves inside, and now they're being besieged. Quite a remarkable shift of events, though I will say, I imagine after besieging a city for so long, you probably have some insight on how better to defend it.
Crusaders didn't abandon.
I mean, not that they really have the men to defend it. Or, well, maybe they do, but Kerbogha has a lot more men, so I guess we'll see.
La Marie. Wave after wave was repelled, but it was too much for the makeshift fort, and it was abandoned and destroyed a few days later. Now both sides were fixated on the citadel. Kerbogha replaced Yagisian's son with one of his own men, showing his true intentions regarding Antioch, and prepared his forces, which could trickle into the city via the Iron Gate, while the Crusaders...
That is still a tricky situation, so, the Crusaders are now defending the city, but there's a pocket which they do not control. So, this gives Kerbogha a bit of a tactical advantage, though. We'll see how exactly the Crusaders decide to counter that.
Made camp against it, knowing that they would never be secure if it was in enemy hands. Outnumbered 2-1, the Latins made another audacious attack by charging at the Muslims from a southern postern gate and catching them by surprise.
I mean, look, we just talked about the atrocities of the Crusade. That's sort of the dark side. Morally, it's really not justifiable. But watching this series, you do have to say they were not lacking in courage. It was certainly a brave bunch, driven by religious fervor, I suppose. They were willing to charge in there even in the face of certain death. And guys like Bohemond, once again, morally not too reputable, but certainly a very impressive leader of men. So we do have a rather impressive, brave group of experienced veterans here.
While initially successful, this attack led to many casualties, as the Crusaders either overstayed their welcome by looting the Muslim camp, or were trampled on their way back to the tiny gate.
Ooh.
Rather than risking a prolonged siege, where he had to feed 40,000 men, Kerbogha launched an offensive along the steep slope of the mountain, and his troops poured out of the citadel into Antioch through a single jagged pass.
Wow.
This attack was coordinated with another assault along the south walls, forcing the Crusaders to fight on two fronts. For 2 days, the assault raged on from dawn to dusk.
I mean, sure, they are fighting on two fronts, but Kerbogha, his men have to go through this, rather narrow area, so I feel like he's not really able to use the full numerical superiority of his army to his advantage.
And a Crusader who lived through this terror remarks that a man with food had no time to eat, and a man with water no time to drink.
Wow.
Endless waves of attackers were cut down, only for more to appear. The cold winter now seemed like a distant dream, as men collapsed from exhaustion under the summer heat. Many, including well-known knights, began to desert by throwing ropes over the walls.
Really?
Their number was so great that the rest called them rope dancers. Most of them were rounded up and slain by the Seljuks.
Yeah, I mean, one, you're going to abandon at this point, and two, you really think you're going to be able to get out of there? You don't stand a chance. You're better to stand and fight. I mean, really, that's... I know it doesn't look great, but even so, it's a better chance of survival than trying to flee and then getting, murdered by a Seljuk arrow.
In order to prevent the total collapse of the garrison, the leaders swore an oath not to abandon the city and sealed the gates. The unrelenting assault, difficult conditions, and death toll were more severe than anything the Crusaders had to face before. At one point, Beaumont, who was in the thick of the fighting, was surrounded by enemies and was narrowly saved by Robert of Flanders and Robert of Normandy, while elsewhere...
I don't even have to say it at this point, but of course Bohemond was right in the thick of it. You could just imagine him charging in, cutting down his enemies. He's about to be murdered every 2 seconds. I mean, this guy's crazy. Or he's incredibly brave. He is in there. Really no regard for his own safety. Yet he's made it this far, remarkably. He hasn't been killed. Clearly, there's an element of luck on his side.
An Italian knight, known to us as Mad Hugh, defended a tower single-handedly, breaking 3 spears in the process.
It is also interesting. I'm not a military historian, so maybe this isn't entirely true, but, I am more familiar with, say, modern history, or Napoleonic, post-Napoleonic warfare, and of course you need a well-trained group of men, but to a certain extent, if you think about a lot of fighting in the 1800s, it's a lot of dudes standing in a line and shooting at each other. And of course, training and skills comes into play, but in this style of combat we're seeing here, I mean, you can really have one guy who's an extremely good fighter, and he will take down several enemies. It seems like skill is more of an element here than it is in more modern, say, firearm-based warfare, right? It seems like skill, experience, talent really plays a big role here. Like if you're a skilled fighter, a great swordsman, that really gives you far more of a benefit than if you're a skilled shooter in the Napoleonic Wars.
4 days into the endless onslaught, Beaumont ordered several buildings to be burned down after finding out that some men were hiding there.
Jeez.
As one might expect, the fire got out of hand and burned a large chunk of the city. On the night of the 13th to 14th of June, at the brink of the Crusader collapse, a comet was seen in the dark sky. There are too many comets in this sci-fi story, which the clergy used to rally the soldiers one last time.
Of course, we have another sign from God. Very convenient.
This glimpse of hope gave them the strength to last the night. This comet, alongside the fire burning from within the city.
But yeah, this, from the Crusaders, I mean, so far, there have not been any special tricks, no strategies, nothing. This is just pure drive, determination, perseverance. That's all it is from these knights, or these crusading men. They are just standing there and fighting for days on end with no rest, very little food, very little water, as they see their allies die around them, and there seems to be a relentless horde of enemies coming through the gates. They're just standing there, stealing their nerves and fighting. It's truly remarkable.
Demoralized the Seljuks, who pulled back after one of the bloodiest battles in medieval warfare.
Jesus.
Kerbogha suffered terrible losses, but so did the Crusaders. So the Muslim army spread out and completely surrounded the city. Now,
they're not out of it yet. The Crusaders still have to work out how they're going to get out of this situation or how they're going to defeat Kerbogha.
All they had to do was wait and watch the Latins die from starvation atop the citadel. Desperate and with no way out, Godfrey lost 200 men in an attempt to raid the Muslim camp outside St. Paul's Gate.
Jesus.
Meanwhile, Tancred went on a stealth mission with 10 men.
The Muslim forces want to sit and wait for the Crusaders to starve. If there's anything I know about these Crusaders, is that they will not sit still. They're going to do something. And that something is probably charge out and just fight for their lives, even if it seems like an absolute suicide mission.
And returned with 6 Seljuk heads, and Henri of Esch repelled a whole contingent attempting to climb the walls with ladders with just 2 of his relatives, who gave their life in the process.
This is what I'm saying. In a battle like this, you can have 3 guys who are just exceptionally skilled, and they can repel tens of men, versus, go to more modern warfare. 3 very talented guys with guns, it's just not going to happen, There's just... The skill differential does not matter as much. It still matters. I do think it still matters. But here, at least to me, it seems like the skill levels matter more. Like I said, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some of you medieval historians can correct me on that. But that's sort of the impression I get.
Despite these brave attempts, the situation seemed hopeless as the weeks dragged on. To fight off hunger, the Crusaders boiled the skins of horses, camels, donkeys, and woodland plants as their numbers continued to decline. But then on June 10th, a peasant from Provence named Peter Bartholomew confessed that he had been having visions, telling him that the spear that pierced
another sign from God
Jesus during his crucifixion was now buried under the Basilica of St. Peter. Many, including Bishop Adhemar, were skeptical about this tale, since they saw the Holy Lance in the vault of Constantinople during their journey. But others, like Raymond, believed Peter and commissioned 12 men who began the excavation.
it is kind of interesting in this era of such strong faith that you have someone who has a vision, and then the people have to decide for themselves, do I believe this or am I skeptical? And it's kind of funny to see skepticism from Adamar, who's willing to believe so much, every other sign from God. But then with this one, he's like, I don't quite believe it. Of course, like I said, it's a different worldview, right? And, very different from the way that many of us view things. So, of course, it makes sense to them. But it is kind of interesting to look at from our perspective, having skepticism when it seems like, you rely on faith for most other decisions.
Despite digging for an entire day, they found nothing until Peter jumped in the hole barefooted and began to pray. Then suddenly a small shard of metal was found, and the entire host rejoiced. It's difficult to imagine or describe the profound effect that this relic had on the army.
Wow.
But even modern
But it was probably just a random shard of metal.
scholars agree that this shard had a profound impact on Crusader morale.
But of course, it doesn't matter if it's just a shard of metal. It's the belief that's what matters. The faith, that is what is driving them in this situation.
Later that year, the Latins would write to the Pope, "We were so comforted and strengthened by the lance's discovery, and by so many other divine revelations, that some of us who had been discouraged and fearful beforehand then became courageous and resolute to fight, and encouraged each other."
I'm sure. I mean, look, you gotta have something to fight for. And, they definitely have something to fight for. And, they also have something that they can just almost blindly or completely blindly put their faith into. That can be a really powerful thing, as we're seeing from the perseverance of these crusaders.
The next 2 weeks were uneventful, as the starving but uplifted crusaders hoped to be reinforced. Peter the Hermit was sent to negotiate with Kerbogha, and
I'm honestly shocked that Peter the Hermit is still playing a role in this series, considering, he's been with us very early on, and his People's Crusade was a complete and utter failure, saddled with countless atrocities and horrific events. He just took a massive L on that one, and yet, as we've seen, the actual Crusaders are still sending him out to do diplomacy missions. I just cannot believe he's still a relevant figure in this series.
offered a group trial by combat, where 5, 10, 20 or 100 men on each side would fight to prevent mass casualties. But the Atabeg simply laughed in his face and demanded that they surrender and convert to Islam.
Yeah, there's not a chance he would accept that. I mean, obviously, there is some idea of honor and dignity, and so there's a chance that an opponent could accept that deal, but not when they have such numerically superior forces. Now, obviously, that would not at all be beneficial for Kerbogha to accept, and he knows exactly what they're trying to do.
If they wanted to live. The Latins were trapped and decided to pursue an extremely aggressive and bold strategy. They would forfeit their defensive positions in order to sally out and attack the enemy head-on.
Yeah, I mean, what did I say a couple minutes earlier? If I know anything about the Crusaders, is that they're not just gonna stay still. They're gonna do something, which is probably charge out in a seemingly suicidal head-on attack against the enemy. Exactly what they're doing now.
Burmah was elected as commander-in-chief of the entire army. The men fasted for 3 days, shared bread and wine, and marched out of the city on the first light of June 28, 1098.
All right.
Burmah divided his now nearly entirely infantry-based army of 20,000, including some non-combatants, into...
I mean, to be fair, that's still a pretty sizable force. I mean, they're probably outnumbered roughly 2 to 1, but, you know, that's a pretty sizable army. You know, you can definitely do something with that.
To 4 equal contingents. The northern French under the 2 Roberts, Lotharingians and Germans commanded by Godfrey, and the southern French led by Adhemar. Burmah himself, as always, held the reserve, made up of southern Italians, and Raymond, who was ill, was left with 200 men to guard the city against the citadel. Heralds were deployed to ensure the cohesion of each of the 4 groups, and Hugh of Vermandois led a squadron of archers which beat back the first line of Muslims. Under the cover of Frankish arrows, each division was allowed to cross the river onto the plain and join in formation. The Muslim force was far larger, but spread out in order to maintain the blockade, and it took some time for Kerbogha to receive the news of the audacious movements, since his camp was 5 kilometers to the north.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, Bohemond is the commander-in-chief in this situation, but, you know, you have an army with so many leaders. On some level, you think that would sort of harm cohesion, and we have seen that the Crusaders have definitely been divided at points. But, you know, I suppose it can also be helpful to have such an influential leader every so often. You know, they can inspire the men around them, they can lead charges. There is definitely a benefit to that, even though, of course, there are disadvantages.
Writing many years later, the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir explained events by claiming that the following discussion between Kerbogha and his advisors happened. The Muslims said to Kerbogha, "You should go up to the city and kill them one by one as they come out. It's easy to pick them off now that they have split up." He replied, "Wait until they have all come out, and then we will kill them."
Okay.
Kerbogha knew that if he ordered a quick response, the Crusaders would most likely retreat back into the walls after a brief skirmish, and what he wanted was a decisive victory. But rather than taking his time, taking the city, or using his mounted archers to harass the sluggish and hungry Crusaders, he then ordered a rushed, disorganized advance. Meanwhile, the Latins were busy fighting off an enemy from the south, which rushed in from the back. But the rearguard fought with such ferocity, despite taking heavy casualties, that the enemy was repelled and forced to flee, disconnected from the rest of the Seljuk host.
Jeez.
Numerous tents were scattered around the siege lines, preventing the Seljuks from fully committing to their steppe tactics.
It looks like the Crusaders' strategy of charge out and fight as hard as you can might be about to work. And to be fair, it's worked many times before, so you know I shouldn't be that shocked. But it's remarkable every time it works.
Especially since their commander was missing. It is important to remember that, unlike the Crusaders, their coalition only had one leader, who was now smashing against his own routed troops. He tried to rally his men and charged against the riderless knights, but the
Yeah, and that's sort of related to what I just said. Kerbogha is the only leader of this force, and his force is so spread out, and it also seemingly lacks cohesion, that in this case, the Crusaders are better with their multiple leaders. You know, even though that can be divisive, in this case, it manages to keep them together to, you know, when everyone has a unified cause, it's beneficial.
line of heavy infantry held. At close quarters, the Muslims were no match for the Westerners, and it didn't take long for them to turn and flee. One Muslim chronicler reports, "The Franks, though they were in the extremity of weakness, advanced in battle order against the armies of Islam, which were at the height of their strength and numbers, and they broke the ranks of the Muslims and scattered their multitudes."
Wow. That's crazy.
The camp was overrun and ravaged, the citadel surrendered, and the Muslim coalition was defeated.
The Crusaders, who were outnumbered about 2 to 1, you know, on the verge of starvation, exhausted, many of them probably very ill, have managed to get out there and with, you know, the fear of God in their hearts clearly, fight for their lives and have succeeded.
Every leader stuck to Bohemond's plan and capitalized on the morale from the Holy Lance as well as the desperation. The Crusaders seemed to have been worlds away from home, and yet again they were victorious against all odds.
Jesus.
The road to Jerusalem was open. Our series on the First Crusade will continue in the coming weeks, so make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps us immensely.
All right. It's honestly crazy. You know, we've gone so far, and yet we still have more to go. I really enjoyed this one. This was a really eventful episode. We finally saw the end to the siege of Antioch, and then, you know, we got a I guess a series of very impressive battles. In this video we really highlighted the brutality of the Crusades, which I think is important to look at, and then also the skill and perseverance of the Crusaders themselves. So yeah, this was a really good one. I really enjoyed this one. I've been enjoying this series up until this point. If you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are doing well today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.